Hey everyone, my name is Daniel Monazemek, and this is my portion of this week's video presentation. I read the 3 chapters of Teaching Argument Writing and did my own activity, which took up the majority of the video, so I cannot summarize the readings, which is okay because you all read them anyways. But in short, it was about doing research and implementing research activities where students do their own research and observations to come up with their own answer to a question and argue based on what they found. So it also included making judgments based off of criteria and how to plan for research and making arguments and judgments. So in short, I did that with my 3 cousins. I know there's some flaws with what I did, but I only had 12 minutes and it was kind of hard to implement something so formal such as a research problem with something in my field, which is environmental education. My cousins also had no formal knowledge of what's going on. I asked if they can help me with a video project and bribed them with ice cream a little bit. They came over. I gave them the question, which you'll see in a bit, and I said, go out there, make observations, and then come back, and I want you to tell me what you think based off of the observations you made. Now, I know there's flaws. They included their opinions, but they did make a conclusion based off of what they witnessed. Now, I do need to note that there probably is some bias because my cousins are outdoor lovers, so that could affect their opinion, their answer a little bit. And this was not scripted. They went out, they did their own thing. I know there was some issues. I know there's some bias. So in the comment section, please let me know what I did wrong and what I could do to be better, as well as another activity I could do. Or please say something that you could do in your classroom or your field to implement your own research activity in which your students can find their own research and observations and make arguments like we read about. So thank you, and I hope you find my activity a little bit interesting or maybe something that can kind of influence what you do with your students. Okay everyone, now that I've talked about what the readings are about, it's time to implement them into something that I could possibly do in my field. And luckily I have my 3 cousins here with me today. And there's been a legitimate issue about dead trees in my backyard known as ash trees, and my dad wants to cut them down because they're dead and he wants to use them for firewood. But we're going to see if they have other uses to come up with the conclusion of whether or not we should cut the trees down. So we'll go step by step with what we talked about earlier and solve this problem. Okay, so now we're in my backyard. I have my cousins here as helpers, and this is one of the dead ash trees that my dad wants to cut down. And now we got to go through the step-by-step protocol. So what was step number 1? Molly, could you tell us what that was?
Whether ash trees should be cut down for firewood.
Awesome, awesome. So that is the problem that we are trying to solve. Okay, step 2 is just to plan on and form an investigation. So now these 3 will come up with an idea about what they're going to do to help determine whether or not the ash tree should be cut down. So what do you guys think? What would you do for your first step? What would you do with the trees?
Go look at it, go investigate it.
You'd investigate the trees? Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. We'll start with this first big one right here. And then step 3 was conduct a survey. That was for a different example. And then after we have our findings, then we'll interpret them and then we'll create an argument about what we should do for our decision. So just tell the camera anything that you notice about the tree.
I noticed woodpecker holes, right?
So there's holes in the trees that could be woodpecker holes, it looks like.
Animals are still using them. And it looked like...
So animals are still using the tree even though it's
It
dead.
looked like the animals that were here used beetles.
Okay, so second big finding was that there's definitely some signs of insect use here.
And you could birds could still come on the branch, and you could put bird feeders out.
So another idea is this would be good for bird feeders.
Yeah. For a bird's nest, could be a bird's home.
Birds could nest in here. Now we're seeing a lot of signs of insects in the tree. Do you think things might want to eat those insects?
Yeah.
So do you think that might be why the woodpecker holes are there?
Yeah.
So it seems like this ash tree is still having a lot of use even though it is dead. So let's move on to the second tree. Let's move on to the second ash tree. Okay, this is ash tree number 2 that my dad wants to cut down. And we'll just give this one some observations as well.
Again, this one has woodpecker. Yeah, and the beetle marks.
So you think those holes are from woodpeckers?
Yeah.
Pecking into the tree?
Yeah. And it could easily have bird feeders on it. You could put bird feeders on it.
So,
Bird nest.
so it definitely still has a lot of use.
Yes.
That's what you would say. And does it look like it's in danger of falling on anybody at any time, maybe?
I think it's sturdy. It's just the bark that's going off. Yeah, it's sturdy.
So it's pretty safe. So far we have the trees are safe. They're not in danger of falling on anyone. The trees are still used by insects and animals such as birds. And you can see holes going all the way up the tree. So we have some arguments there. We're gonna go find some other ash trees and see if we can come up.
There's a piece of corn in this one.
Something in there. I don't know what that is. So we'll go see if we can find any other ash trees and make some other observations. Okay, so as we're out here observing, there's a woodpecker in the tree right now. So there's a good chance that what we saw earlier could actually be woodpecker holes. It is. There's another bird up there, but yeah, that is a downy woodpecker. So they do use the tree. This tree still has use even though it is dead. So as stated in the reading, that a good research problem must have two sides of the argument. So I'm going to bring up ideas on the other side. So my dad sees those dead trees as useless and he wants to cut them down for firewood. Firewood's expensive. We saw 2 dead ash trees so far, but I would imagine that there's more back there. And they would provide a lot of fuel. They're an eyesore when it's in the summer and there's a lot of trees out here. They look dead. They don't look very nice. So that's the ideas that my dad has about cutting down the tree. So with that in mind, you're gonna come up with your own conclusion based on the results that you observed, and then you're gonna make a judgment call, because in chapter 2 of the reading, it was about learning to make judgments based on criterion. I'm gonna give you different criteria of whether or not the tree will be cut down, and then you're going to make judgments based off that as well, okay? So first of all, what do you think? So Molly, we'll start with you first. What do you think about the trees? What's your decision? And then tell us your observations and why you decided that.
I think you shouldn't cut them down because a lot of birds use those trees. Like, whoa, there's a bird on it. It's a woodpecker gun.
Yep, there's another woodpecker. There's another one on the ground, a different bird. That's a junco. So that's your big point. Is there anything else you want to share?
Yeah, if I were a bird, then I would use that tree for like food and other things. I wouldn't want it to be cut down and used firewood, because that's, if I had to feed other birds, that would be useful to me, because that's where I get my food.
Alrighty, awesome. Maddie, what's your take on it? If it's the same, you can let us know. But if you have any other ideas?
I think you should keep it, because like if you would cut down the trees, then the bird population might go down, because the trees, and they have no home, and if they can't live on like the ground, they have to live up in a tree. So they can't live, like they wouldn't be able to live if you cut down all the trees.
Okay, so you think the trees are important for the birds as well, and that if you got rid of some of those trees, those birds might be in some kind of trouble. All right, Dane, I'm gonna ask for your opinion, and then I'm gonna throw a couple scenarios at you to have you make different kinds of judgments, because you're a little bit older and you might face a little tougher research problems in your classes.
I think you should keep it because it is a good place for birds to rest and insects to live. And then birds could also get, it's a source of food for the birds if insects are living
Okay,
in trees.
And he's saying that based off of everything we saw. So we kind of have a unanimous decision to keep the trees. Okay, so after all their observations, all 3 of them have come up with their argument of keeping the trees around because they provide uses for animals and insects, and also the fact that they are not dangerous or close to falling, so they cannot hurt anyone. Now we're going to do something different. The second chapter of the reading was more about making judgments, and you made an original judgment to save the trees, to keep the trees, but the judgments are based on different criteria. So I'm going to give you some different scenarios and you're going to come up with that. So if my dad said that he would cut down the trees unless they are useful to anything that includes animals, or if they're dangerous, he's going to cut down the trees, what would you all think the answer would be? What would you all say? What would your judgment call be for there?
I would say that it's useful to woodpeckers because, I mean, it's obviously wood and they get food from there.
Okay, so it is useful. That's one thing. So what are we saying here?
And it is sturdy.
So it's not. You don't think it's going to hurt anyone?
No.
So what's the final judgment based on that criteria?
I think it's.
What do you think? Keep it?
Yeah,
Do you want to keep it?
Yeah.
Okay. Here's a different scenario here. Now my dad he doesn't really care too much about the birds in this scenario, and say eventually he just says the birds are fine, there's a lot of trees out there, we need outward trees to be useful for people. They need to provide shade or do something nice, or at least be aesthetically pleasing, meaning that they look nice. So based on that criteria, where the animals don't really come into account and it just has to be good for human use, would you say log these trees for firewood, or would you say leave the trees where they are?
Leave the trees where they are because trees give you oxygen.
But it's a dead tree,
Oh,
remember? So it's not doing any of that.
I don't know.
But
Use it for firewood.
what do you think? All right, Dane says use it for firewood.
In that case, I would use it for firewood because, I mean, if you look at that, A, there's not a lot of branches. B, leaves don't go off of it because it's dead. So, I mean, like, in that case, you would want to cut it down for firewood. Or you could also use it for, like, different, you could, like, if you cut it down, then you could carve it. You don't have to use it for firewood.
Okay,
You could just, like, carve it.
but we would cut it down, so that's the final thing. So we got all three of you saying cut it down.
Yes.
So our judgments are always different based on the criteria, and you took a couple examples and you applied your observations and you came up with judgment calls. So awesome job. On behalf of my class, I'd like to say thank you to my three cousins for volunteering and helping with this video project, and now I can take them for ice cream and act up on that bribe that I promised them for helping me out. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Bailey Radel, and I am taking LAI414. My part of the YouTube presentation this week will be discussing the TED Talk by Jeffrey Canada and Chapter 10 of the Schutte book entitled Assessment Through Collaborative Critique by Sarah Robbins, Sue Poper, and Jennifer Harrod. Alright, let's get started. So these are my main takeaways from Jeffrey Canada's TED Talk. So, when he attended the schools in the Bronx 56 years ago, they were lousy, and if we look at the adequate yearly progress of these schools since then, not much has changed. So, Jeffrey Canada's point was that if the American public education system is like a business, then it's not a very good business model, because if you do the same thing year after year and you're not seeing the results that you want, you're not selling the products that you want, or your bridges are falling down or something like that, then you have to look at the research, look at different examples in the field, and do internal reviews to make sure that you are implementing the best practices in order to have a successful business. So, for Jeffrey Canada, he believes that charter schools can provide a good example to public education in order to provide us with different examples, and if these charter schools are successful and they are implementing better practices that work and their students are improving their test scores and getting into college with higher rates and completing college with higher rates, then we should be copying what those charter schools are doing. So that provided a really interesting contrast to the interview that we read a few weeks ago with former Secretary of Ed John King Jr., and he provided a more conservative view of charter schools that view charter schools as a drain of public resources from the other public schools to charter schools. So it was very interesting to hear Jeffrey Canada's view of charter schools as this, new creative place where teachers and principals can try different practices and collect data and report on this data and then if it ends up working for their students, then we can also implement these new practices in our school districts as well. I think that his point neglects the fact that schools and districts, public schools and districts, can also try new reading programs, new math programs, new writing programs, new science programs. They can also look at the research and try to implement different evidence-based practices into their classrooms, and they can also collect data and share it with other schools and districts. And if they find that that works with the students as well, then they can do that as well. So it's interesting to see that his support of the charter schools is this idea of a new factory of ideas, but public schools could also be that new factory of ideas as well. He also discusses the problem with testing, which is the idea that the results that we get from testing are delayed because we don't receive them until the end of the summer, and then by that point we have new students coming to us in September. And that really neglects the fact that teachers are doing summative and formative assessments throughout the year, and that the point of testing is to tell the higher-ups, the state and the federal government and the funders, that our students are making progress, they're meeting these standards, things like that. The goal of teachers is to already know how their students are doing. They are not blind to the students' progress until they take the standardized exam 3/4 of the way through the school year. So that's a problem, but not really a problem. And then he really also just emphasized the importance of research. You need to look at research in your field that has happened in real classrooms, and if these teachers have seen and done new things that have worked with their students and have increased their understanding, then you should try to implement it into your classroom with fidelity, as close to the original design as you can, and see if it works in your classroom. And so I thought that was a really important focus that Jeffrey Canada had. So those were some of my thoughts on the TED Talk by Jeffrey Canada, and now the rest of my presentation will be on Chapter 10 of Shooty, Assessment Through Collaborative Critique. So this writing project was modeled after 3 teachers' experiences at the Kennesaw Mountain Writing Project. So during the following school year, 1994, these 3 teachers, a elementary school teacher, a middle school teacher, and a college professor that taught writing to pre-service teachers, decided to make a writing project where students would write letters to one another between grades. So the college students would write to the middle schoolers, and the elementary students would write to the middle schoolers, and then the middle schoolers had the arguably harder job of writing to both groups of people. And the emphasis of these letters was on content and the ability to write for a particular audience over spelling, punctuation, or grammar. And then during the course of writing these letters, students also wrote reflections where they pointed out different pitfalls and weaknesses in their writing, and then the teachers would look at the reflections and create mini lessons that looked at the students' pitfalls and taught to improve them. So it was really interesting because when you see assessment through collaborative critique, you really think of critique as someone with a red pen, maybe a teacher reading the letters beforehand, or maybe the students could have done like peer revision groups or something like that, so it seemed a little bit less red pen. But while revisions were encouraged and students were encouraged to share their letters with people in their classroom for advice on sentence structure and content and things like that, it wasn't required, and the teachers didn't even read the letters before the students sent them to their pen pals. So that was very interesting. In addition, one of the major complaints that people had when these teachers suggested doing an ungraded writing project was that having no grade associated with it would make students lazier or produce a lower quality product. And the teachers found that that was not the case, that students that, did not care about writing that much and did not care about other assignments that the teachers had found that they had used in the past, these students really enjoyed writing letters to their pen pals. And even students that were absent that day in middle school made sure that they still were able to send in their letter on time because they didn't want their pen pal to miss out. So they made sure to turn in their assignment on time even though it wasn't even going to be graded. So this really points to the idea that as long as you have a very structured and engaging activity, students care less about the grade and more about putting in a good effort. So I thought that that was really interesting. At the same time, I think it's important to realize that there wasn't much critique going on, as even though it says in the title collaborative critique. So I thought that it was also a really good study in seeing how being exposed to different writing techniques and more advanced writing can make our students better writers. So for example, when the middle schoolers read letters from the college students, they started to copy the different characteristics that they read and saw in the college students' letters. So if the college students had drawings in there, or they used special stationery, or they played around with the words on the page, how it was formatted on the page, then we also saw that the middle schoolers also wrote letters that mimicked the advanced students' writing. So I thought that was very interesting as well. So I had 3 of my siblings do this exercise. Thomas was in 5th grade, Hayden was in 7th grade, and Lily was in 8th grade. So because they already knew each other, we couldn't do the basic pen pal introductions that the authors did in Assessment Through Collaborative Critique. So I just offered some prompts to the students just so that they could get started on their letter writing, like what's the best part of your life, what's your favorite restaurant, what do you find interesting to learn about, just hoping to give the students a good starting point so they weren't like, what should we write about? In addition, I thought it was interesting, something came up that I didn't think was going to come up. I didn't realize that there was so much sibling rivalry and bantering between my one sister and my one brother in particular. There was one moment when Hayden said, "Oh, Thomas, your handwriting, really bad." And I was shocked because I didn't know that she was going to say that. And then, I still had to respond because unkind things like that aren't going to be allowed in a classroom. When people are still learning how to write and spell and use commas and things like that, I can't just let the other students put them down. So for me, I realized that I really need to work on my classroom management skills because I was shocked and I faltered a little bit to respond. And later on, I'm thinking, oh, well, maybe I should have stopped the lesson and took Hayden aside and said, listen, he's still learning, he's younger than you, maybe you can help him out sometime or something like that, instead of, just letting comments like that slide. So I thought that was an interesting thing that came up while I was doing this letter writing project. So the correspondence between Hayden and Thomas was the most interesting to me. So Thomas, the youngest student's letter, is on the left, and Hayden, the middle student letter, is on the right. So I noticed that Thomas had some trouble with his grammar and punctuation. So, and also just the ability to format a letter. So as you'll see, he said, "Dear, Hayden," and when he signed it, he said, "Your brother, Tommy," but he used texting language, he said, "You are." And then when he was writing the actual body of his paragraph, he forgot some punctuation or something like that. So he said, "What's your favorite restaurant? Mine's Moe's," when it should be, "What's your favorite restaurant? ? Mine's Moe's." So it was interesting because later on I asked if he felt rushed, and maybe, that would have led to some slipping up in punctuation or grammar. But he said, "No, 5 minutes was plenty of time. I ran out of things to say." So I thought that was interesting. So as a teacher, if I had the students do a reflection later on, hopefully I would realize that Thomas is struggling with commas and punctuation. So it's important to do a mini lesson later on how to format a letter and why it's important to use question marks so that our pen pals know that we're asking them a question and we want a response. So that was interesting to note. And then when you come over to Hayden, she did something that I did not ask her to do, but she did anyways. She said, also, you may not do as well on that comma test as you might think. It should be Dear Hayden with a comma after the N, not after the R. So she critiqued Thomas, and I would have never thought to tell Hayden to point out his mistakes or something like that, because that's not her job to tell him that his commas are in the wrong place or something. But I did see a little bit of that when I was looking at the Shooty article, because the college students would prompt the students in their letters for more details. There's the example of, do you like Christmas? Tell me why. So they're always prompting them for more explanations for their answers. So there's definitely a place for the older students to foster the writing of the younger students, even if it's not explicit as you might not do as well on that comma test as you might think. So I thought that was very interesting.
Question for you. So usually letter writing isn't graded. So do you think that would make people more likely to not take it seriously? Or do you think people would still like to write good letters to their pen pals?
I think that as long as you didn't tell people that it wasn't graded, they wouldn't really know. But actually, no. Well, okay, so a lot of my teachers, they just do completion grades.
Okay.
Like, if you do your homework, then you get a 5 out of 5. But that's basically it. So I think it would be good if, you were like, okay, well, you need to have a complete letter by tomorrow. And then if it's complete, then you get a 5 out of